Oh, I feel this word deep in my spirit today. Somebody needs to understand that being chosen didn't start when you got that promotion. It didn't start when you got saved. No, no, no. You were chosen before you even knew how to spell the word purpose. You were chosen since childhood. Unexplainable favor and protection from the very beginning. There was something different about you. You didn't have the words to explain it, but you could feel it in your bones. You weren't like everybody else. There were moments in your childhood when you walked through danger and came out untouched. Times when you found yourself in situations that should have consumed you, but somehow, some way you were covered. It wasn't by accident. It wasn't by coincidence. It was divine intervention. Think back to those moments when you should have been caught up in something destructive. Friends around you made decisions that led them down dark paths, but you were redirected. You were spared. When others fell into traps, you stepped right over them without even knowing they were there. Doors that should have slammed in your face suddenly opened, and rooms you had no business being in welcomed you in. It didn't make sense then, and maybe it still doesn't make sense now, but that's the nature of favor defies explanation. There were times when people tried to break you, but their words didn't stick. You endured environments that were toxic, yet your spirit remained intact. It wasn't because you were stronger, it was because you were covered. God stationed angels around you, shielding you from harm you never even saw. There were moments when sickness tried to creep in, but healing was already in motion. Accidents were set up, but they couldn't touch you. The enemy had plans, but they couldn't prosper because God had already spoken over your life. You might not have grown up in the best neighborhood. Maybe the odds were stacked against you. Poverty, dysfunction, chaos, it was all around you, but somehow you rose above it. Somehow the violence missed your doorstep. Somehow the addiction that ran in your family didn't run through you. Somehow the generational curses lost their grip when they got to you. People wonder why you're still standing, why you didn't crumble under the weight of what you experienced. It's because favor was wrapped around you like a shield. And let's talk about the times when you didn't even know you were in danger. You were a child, playing, laughing, living, unaware of the traps being set around you. Yet every snare the enemy placed was dismantled before it could reach you. Every plot against your mind, every scheme against your body, every plan against your future, God shut it down before it could touch you. Remember those moments when you made mistakes that could have ruined your life. Choices that could have sent you in the wrong direction. Yet somehow grace rerouted you. You weren't perfect, but God's favor didn't require perfection. His protection was not based on your performance, but on His promise. Even in the loneliness, even in the rejection, even when you didn't understand why certain doors closed, it was God's protection. Some friendships didn't last, not because you weren't lovable, but because God was preserving your purpose. Some opportunities slipped through your fingers, not because you weren't qualified, but because God knew that door would have led to destruction. What looked like loss was actually divine protection. The covering on your life wasn't loud. It wasn't always obvious. It moved in silence, working behind the scenes. People saw you standing, but they didn't see what tried to knock you down. They saw your smile, but they didn't see the storms you survived. You didn't even realize half of the things God blocked because He was moving so far ahead of you. Every time you wondered, why didn't that happen to me? It was because you were wrapped in favor. Every time the enemy tried to touch you, God said, not this one is mine. You were set apart before you even understood what it meant to be chosen. His hand was on you, guiding you, sheltering you, preserving you for something greater than yourself. Early maturity beyond your years from a young age, you carried a weight that others couldn't see and wouldn't understand. While other children were carefree, running wild without a thought in the world, you were thinking deeper, feeling stronger, and seeing further than your years should have allowed. It wasn't that you didn't want to play or laugh, it's just that something inside you was already awakened. You noticed things others ignored, you questioned things others accepted, conversations that bored others fascinated you, ideas that seemed too big for a child's mind fit perfectly in yours. You weren't being difficult, you were being developed. There were moments when people looked at you and wondered why you didn't act your age. Family members may have said you were too serious or grown for your age, but what they didn't realize was that God was giving you the ability to process life through a different lens. He was planting seeds of wisdom long before they could bloom. While others needed to be told right from wrong, you instinctively knew. While others were focused on the moment, you were already thinking about consequences. This wasn't something you chose, this was something chosen in you. You remember being the one people leaned on, even when you didn't have the strength yourself. You were the child the adults confided in, the sibling who kept the family grounded, the friend who offered advice beyond your years. You could sense pain in people before they spoke. You could feel the tension in a room before others noticed. Now, you were a child in body, but carried the heart of someone much older. And though it felt heavy at times, it wasn't a burden, it was preparation. You may have wondered why you couldn't just be like everyone else. Why didn't certain things interest you the way they did your peers? Why did the small things that excited others feel empty to you? It's because your spirit was being trained for something greater. God was teaching you responsibility before you knew what responsibility was. He was shaping your character, sharpening your mind, and softening your heart. You were being built to carry things that others couldn't handle. While others were chasing attention, you were searching for understanding. While others were driven by trends, you were driven by truth. Even in your youth, you thought about the future. You carried dreams so big they scared you, but you couldn't let them go. God gave you a vision that was too large for your environment, and it made you feel out of place. It wasn't that you were better than anyone, it was that you were built for something different. There were times when you felt isolated, misunderstood, even rejected. You wanted to fit in, but no matter how hard you tried, something kept setting you apart. Conversations didn't click. Interest didn't align, and though it hurt, that separation was necessary. God was guarding your mind, protecting your spirit, and setting you apart because your assignment required focus. You weren't meant to blend in because what's inside of you was never designed to be common. Even in school, teachers may have noticed it. Maybe you weren't the loudest in the room, but when you spoke, people listened. Maybe you weren't the fastest learner, but you understood concepts on a deeper level. Authority figures sensed something different about you. Some tried to nurture it, and others didn't know how to handle it. But that's because the calling on your life couldn't be taught, it had to be revealed. There were moments when life forced you to grow up faster than you wanted. Maybe you had to take on responsibilities in your family that weren't yours to carry. Maybe you had to become the emotional anchor for others while still trying to figure out your future. The weight of that responsibility didn't crush you because God was stretching your capacity. He was teaching you how to handle pressure with grace, how to navigate storms with wisdom, and how to carry burdens without breaking. While other kids were dreaming of toys, you were dreaming of solutions. While others were concerned about being popular, you were concerned about making an impact. That wasn't immaturity, it was divine intentionality. God was maturing you early because your destiny demanded it. He was giving you wisdom that couldn't come from books and understanding that couldn't come from experience alone. There were times when you questioned why you always had to be the strong one, why you always had to be the responsible one, why you always had to be the understanding one. But God was using those moments to build resilience in you. He was developing leadership in you before you knew what leadership was. You were learning how to solve problems, how to manage emotions, how to discern people, and all of this was happening while you were still growing. Even in your quiet moments, you were thinking, reflecting, planning. You were searching for meaning in places others overlooked. The maturity in you wasn't forced, it was formed. Formed through challenges, formed through experiences, formed through isolation, and formed through divine encounters that even now you can barely explain. You didn't know it then, but God was equipping you for battles you hadn't yet faced and victories you hadn't yet imagined. Rejection and isolation, there's a weight that comes with being set apart, a silent burden that presses on your shoulders when you realize you don't quite fit in. From an early age, rejection seemed to follow you like a shadow. People didn't always understand you. Friends drifted away. Opportunities slipped through your fingers, and circles you wanted to be part of never opened up for you. You watched others get invited, included, celebrated while you sat on the outside, wondering why you weren't enough. It wasn't that you didn't try to belong. You did. You bent, you stretched, you dimmed your light just to be accepted, but no matter what you did, it felt like you were always the one left out. Family members may have misunderstood you. Friends may have walked away without explanation. Doors you prayed would open remained locked. And in those moments, you questioned your worth. You wondered what was wrong with you, why relationships were so fragile, why people seemed to come and go from your life without warning. But what you didn't see then was that every rejection was a layer of protection. Every closed door was God's way of guiding you away from what would have distracted or destroyed you. There were seasons when loneliness became your closest companion. You sat in rooms full of people yet felt invisible. You smiled when your heart was heavy, laughed when your spirit was tired because expressing that loneliness felt too vulnerable. And while others were surrounded by friends, you walked a path that seemed carved out for you alone. You couldn't understand why relationships that worked so easily for others seemed to crumble in your hands. But that isolation wasn't random. It wasn't by accident. It was deliberate. God was separating you, pulling you back from the noise so he could whisper to you in ways he couldn't if you were surrounded by the crowd. While others were finding comfort in companionship, you were being taught to find comfort in solitude. He was stripping away distractions, pulling back layers of dependence on people, teaching you how to stand on your own. There were seasons when the rejection wasn't silent, it was loud and humiliating. People talked behind your back, friends betrayed you, opportunities you worked hard for were given to others. You felt unseen, undervalued, and overlooked. And the enemy tried to convince you that you were unworthy, that you were unwanted. But even in the sting of rejection, God was refining you. He was toughening your skin, but not hardening your heart. You didn't realize that some of the relationships you cried over losing were actually barriers to your growth. The friendships that dissolved, the people who walked away, they couldn't go where God was taking you. Their presence would have stunted your development, pulled you into cycles you had no business repeating. You thought they were essential to your journey, but God knew they were only meant for a chapter, not the entire story. You wanted acceptance, but God offered alignment. You sought comfort, but he gave you calling. And calling often comes with a price: loneliness. Being chosen means being separated. That separation can feel like punishment when it's actually preparation. In your isolation, God was developing disciplines that would sustain you. While others were busy blending in, you were learning to listen. While they chased applause, you were learning to move in silence. The isolation wasn't to punish you, it was to prepare you. You weren't being excluded, you were being elevated. But elevation often begins in the shadows. You may have felt rejected by people, but you were never rejected by God. He saw every tear you cried behind closed doors. He heard every question in your heart. He understood the pain of being misunderstood, the ache of being left out. And while you were lamenting what you lost, God was orchestrating what you would gain. Sometimes the rejection came from those closest to you. Family who didn't believe in your dreams, friends who mocked your vision. You shared your heart with people who mishandled it. You gave loyalty to those who gave you betrayal. And in those moments, you felt like giving up, like silencing your voice, like shrinking back. But even then, God was using that pain to stretch you, to sharpen you, to build endurance in you. You didn't realize that the isolation was a sacred space. It was in those quiet, lonely places where God began to reveal things to you. Ideas began to form, visions became clearer, and your identity was strengthened. In the absence of applause, you learned how to move without validation. In the absence of company, you learned how to be content with God alone. Every season of rejection was a divine setup. God was pruning relationships, cutting off connections, and closing doors to align you with his purpose. He wasn't just keeping people from you, he was keeping you from people. Not because you were less, but because you were more. More focused, more sensitive to his voice, more prepared for the weight of the calling on your life. You started to notice that the people you admired didn't always stick around. Mentors you thought would guide you forever were only there for a moment. Relationships you thought were solid fell apart without warning. It hurt, but it forced you to lean on God in ways you never would have if you had constant support. The rejection became fuel for your resilience. The isolation became a classroom where God taught you lessons no one else could. You began to realize that you couldn't force connections that weren't meant to last. You stopped begging for seats at tables where God never intended you to sit. You stopped lowering your standards just to be accepted. The rejection started to feel less like loss and more like redirection. The isolation became a sign that God was calling you higher, asking you to walk a path that few could understand. Persistent spiritual sensitivity from an early age. There was something stirring deep within you, something you couldn't fully explain but couldn't ignore. While other children were focused on games and play, you felt drawn to something higher, something deeper. There was a curiosity in your spirit, a longing for understanding that went beyond your years. You felt things others didn't feel. You sensed shifts in the atmosphere that others were completely unaware of. Even in your innocence, you carried a spiritual awareness that couldn't be taught, only placed by the hand of God. There were moments when you would hear things that others seemed to miss. It wasn't an audible voice, but a quiet prompting deep inside. You couldn't articulate it, but you knew when something wasn't right. You could sense when someone was hurting, even if they were smiling. You could feel tension before a word was spoken. That wasn't coincidence. That was sensitivity, an open line of communication between your spirit and the divine. As a child, certain places made you uncomfortable and you didn't understand why. Certain people unsettled your spirit, though they appeared friendly. You may not have been able to explain it, but something within you was discerning. God was fine-tuning your spirit to pick up on things beyond the surface. This sensitivity wasn't always easy to carry. It made you feel different, set apart. Others brushed off what you noticed, laughed off what you took seriously. But that was because they weren't called to carry what you were carrying. You might remember moments when you felt overwhelmed by emotions that didn't seem to belong to you. You'd walk into a room and feel sadness without knowing why. You'd meet someone and immediately sense their pain. You weren't being emotional, you were being entrusted. God was teaching you how to intercede without even realizing it. You were feeling the weight of others not to harm you, but to prepare you for compassion, for leadership, for spiritual authority. There were nights when sleep wouldn't come easily. You'd lie awake with thoughts swirling in your mind, questions about life, about purpose, about God. While others were resting, your spirit was awake, searching for answers to questions you didn't even know how to ask. It wasn't anxiety, it was spiritual stirring. God was awakening something in you, planting seeds of vision and purpose long before you had the language to describe it. You were drawn to things that others ignored. Maybe you loved being in quiet spaces, drawn to the peace that others found boring. Perhaps you found yourself staring at the sky, marveling at creation, or feeling deeply connected during moments of silence. You weren't just daydreaming, you were connecting. God was nurturing your sensitivity to His presence in the stillness. You could sense His nearness in the gentle breeze, in the rustling leaves, in the silence that others feared. You might have been curious about prayer before anyone taught you how. There was a pull towards spiritual things that seemed unexplainable. Maybe you found yourself praying for people without understanding why. Maybe you asked questions about God and life that startled adults because they weren't typical for a child. That wasn't accidental, it was intentional. God was drawing you in, revealing Himself in small glimpses, preparing you for deeper understanding. There were times when you felt the burden of things that weren't your own. You carried weight that didn't make sense. You felt responsible for peace in your home, harmony among friends, and the well-being of others. You weren't meddling, you were spiritually sensitive. God was developing your heart for service, teaching you how to stand in the gap for others, even when they didn't know they needed it. And then there were the dreams. Vivid, intense, and sometimes unsettling. You dreamed of things that later unfolded in real life. You saw things in your sleep that left you wondering how your mind could create such images. But they weren't just dreams, they were glimpses. God was speaking to you in ways your waking mind wasn't yet ready to comprehend. He was showing you fragments of things to come, building your trust in His voice little by little. This sensitivity wasn't always easy to carry. It made you vulnerable in ways others didn't understand. You felt pain more deeply, loved more fiercely, and carried burdens that felt too big for your small shoulders. But even in that, God was molding you. He was expanding your capacity to feel so that you could lead with compassion. He was teaching you that strength isn't always loud, it's often quiet, discerning, and deeply connected to the needs of others. You may have been drawn to worship, to moments of deep reflection, even without understanding why. Maybe you were captivated by certain songs that stirred something in your soul. Maybe being in certain environments made you feel closer to God without anyone having to explain it to you. That was His Spirit awakening yours. You were being taught to recognize His presence in ways that others couldn't comprehend. There were moments when you'd walk away from conversations feeling uneasy, sensing something beneath the surface. You picked up on unspoken words, hidden motives, and unaddressed pain. That wasn't paranoia, it was discernment. God was sharpening your spiritual insight because He knew you would need it to navigate the people and environments tied to your purpose. This sensitivity didn't make you weak, it made you aware. It set you apart. While others moved through life casually, you moved carefully, intentionally. You understood that there was more happening than what the eyes could see. You were spiritually awake in a world that often sleeps. That awareness shaped how you approached decisions, relationships, and opportunities. At times, it felt like a heavy gift. You wanted to turn it off, to numb it, to ignore it, but you couldn't, because it was part of who you were created to be. God trusted you with this sensitivity. He allowed you to feel deeply, to discern quietly, and to hear softly so that you could move boldly. Every moment of spiritual awareness was preparing you to walk in alignment with His will. Unshakable resilience through trials. From the very beginning, your life was marked by challenges that seemed too heavy for your age, too intense for your experience, and too frequent to be coincidental. While others seemed to coast through life with ease, your path was filled with obstacles, setbacks, and storms that threatened to consume you. But somehow, despite it all, you kept standing. You faced pain that should have broken you, betrayal that should have hardened you, and losses that should have silenced you. Yet, here you are, still standing, still breathing, still moving forward. This is not by accident. This is resilience, a resilience forged in the fires of adversity, shaped by the hand of God and refined through trials that others wouldn't have survived. Every hardship you endured wasn't just a random event, it was a training ground. Life tried to suffocate your spirit, but each trial only made you stronger. People may have looked at you and wondered how you kept going. They didn't know the nights you cried yourself to sleep, the mornings you woke up feeling defeated, and the countless times you thought about giving up. But something inside of you refused to let go. That something wasn't pride. It wasn't stubbornness. It was resilience, God's unshakable resilience planted deep within your soul. You faced rejection and still found a way to love. You've been betrayed but still chose to trust again. You've suffered loss but still managed to hope for better days. That kind of strength doesn't come from willpower alone. It comes from being chosen. It comes from knowing that your pain has a purpose and that every storm you've walked through was meant to prepare you for something greater. Think back to the moments when life knocked you down. There were times when you felt completely surrounded by darkness. Doors closed in your face, people you loved walked away, and situations spiraled beyond your control. The weight of it all should have crushed you. And yet instead of breaking, you bent. You adjusted. You adapted. You pressed forward when standing still seemed easier. That's because your resilience wasn't rooted in circumstance, it was rooted in calling. Your resilience wasn't loud or flashy. It didn't always look like victory. Sometimes it looked like quiet determination. Sometimes it looked like getting out of bed when everything in you wanted to stay down. Sometimes it looked like forgiving people who never apologized or smiling when your heart was shattered. You learned how to keep moving, even with tears in your eyes. You learned how to keep believing when everything around you told you to quit. There were moments when people underestimated you, thinking the blows life dealt you would finally knock you out. But what they didn't see was that every hit only made you wiser. Every setback made you more strategic. Every disappointment stretched your capacity to endure. Life thought it could break you, but it only built you. Because God was using every trial to strengthen your foundation, to deepen your roots, and to sharpen your focus. Some battles you fought weren't even visible to others. You carried silent struggles, fears, insecurities, mental battles that no one knew about. Yet you kept showing up, you kept giving, you kept loving, you kept serving. While others crumbled under lesser pressure, you remained anchored. That's because your resilience wasn't about surface strength, it was about spiritual fortitude. God was holding you up when your own strength ran out. You walked through seasons where it felt like everything was falling apart. Financial struggles, broken relationships, health challenges, emotional turmoil, all hitting you at once. And in those moments, the enemy whispered, "This is the end for you." But something louder in your spirit declared, "Keep going." You didn't realize it at the time, but every trial was stripping away what you didn't need and strengthening what you did. You were being fortified for the weight of the assignment God placed on your life. People have marveled at how you bounced back, but what they don't understand is that you didn't just bounce back, you bounced higher. Every time you were knocked down, you rose with more clarity, more wisdom, and more strength. You didn't just survive, you grew, you evolved. You became more of who God created you to be. Trials became your teacher, pain became your platform, and every scar became a story of how God sustained you. Even when it felt like God was silent, He was working. In the seasons when you prayed and felt no response, when you cried and felt unheard, He was strengthening your spirit. He was building endurance in you that comfort could never produce. He allowed certain storms not to destroy you, but to develop you. Because easy roads don't create resilient people. It's the hard paths, the uphill climbs, the dark valleys that carve out unshakable strength. You've learned how to walk with wounds. You've learned how to praise with pain. You've learned how to keep trusting when nothing makes sense. And that resilience isn't just for you. It's for every person connected to your destiny. Because of what you've endured, you now carry the strength to uplift others. You've been through enough to recognize when someone else is struggling, and you have the compassion and wisdom to reach out and help them rise. The resilience in you has been tested and proven. When doors closed, you found windows. When people counted you out, God counted you in. When plans failed, you adapted. You didn't just survive the storm, you learned how to dance in the rain. You learned how to build in the middle of the battle, to create in the middle of the chaos, and to grow in the middle of the pain. And even now, life may continue to test you. Challenges will come. But what's different now is that you know who you are and whose you are. You understand that every setback is a setup for something greater. You've developed a resilience that isn't shaken by circumstances, but anchored in God's promises. What once would have broken you now only strengthened you, because through every trial, every disappointment, In every painful season, God has built in you an unshakable resilience.